so lonely, broken angel. I'm so lonely.
Welcome to the program. Could the Winter Olympic Games be leading to easing of tensions between North and South Korea? After months of bitter accusations, missile tests and military drills, the first talks between the two nations in over 2 years seem to have paid off. The North has agreed to send a delegation to the Games, which take place in neighbouring South Korea next month. And they're not done yet. They've also agreed to hold military talks. Sophie Long reports from Seoul.
North and South Korean delegations shaking hands and exchanging New Year's greetings. This is the first time the two governments have met for more than 2 years. Within hours of negotiations getting underway, the South Korean government announced the first breakthrough. Pyongyang had agreed to send a delegation to the Winter Olympics. It'll include athletes, a cheering squad, and a taekwondo demonstration team. Welcome news, particularly for the South Korean president, who believes the Games are the opportunity for groundbreaking change. The discussions then moved on to other inter-Korean issues, like the thousands of people separated from their families for decades by the heavily fortified border zone they were sitting in.
We propose to hold a Red Cross meeting to discuss family reunions in time for the Lunar New Year, which is a national holiday.
Later, the South Korean government announced a military hotline, closed 2 years ago as relations soured, would reopen. Not everyone here is in favour of these talks. Some believe the South Koreans are being duped by an isolated North Korean leader keen to divide the international community and to lull its neighbour into a false sense of security. But they have been welcomed internationally.
As a neighbour of the Korean Peninsula, we welcome and support all positive steps that will quickly allow an easing of tensions between South and North Korea.
It's hoped that Pyongyang's participation in the Pyeongchang Games will create a period of stability and an environment in which more negotiations can take place. But it's unlikely these talks will get anywhere near dealing with the fundamental issue of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Sophie Long, BBC News, Seoul.
Well, earlier I spoke to Jean Lee, the former Pyongyang bureau chief for the Associated Press, and Jim Ho, a former diplomat who set up the first British embassy in North Korea. I began by asking Jean Lee if these talks would come as a relief to the South Korean authorities.
Today is the 30-day countdown. In exactly a month, South Korea is going to be holding the opening ceremony for the Winter Olympics. So instead of the specter of a nuclear disaster or provocation, they now have the novelty of North Korean athletes. So this is a huge boost for the South Koreans. This is something that they have been working behind the scenes tirelessly on for the past couple months to make sure that they could get North Korea's participation, because it does perhaps offer a little bit of an assurance that things might be quiet and they can actually have a peaceful Olympics.
Jim, is this really a sort of a turning point, given what we've experienced in the past few months?
Well, I first started working on North Korea in the 1970s. The number of turning points there have been quite enormous. It is positive, but, you know, these things often start and they don't really go anywhere. And I think to make very dogmatic judgments too early is probably a mistake. But I think the North Koreans do want to come out of the international isolation which is being imposed upon them. I think they see the Olympics as an opportunity to show that they're not really people with horns and tails. They are just like other people. And if they can develop links with South Korea, they may be able to work on that for further links with the United States in particular. So it's a beginning, it's a positive beginning, but I think one has to be a little careful about being over-enthusiastic.
As you say, we have seen this sort of thing before, namely the Sydney Olympics, for example, when they came out in the opening ceremony under a unified flag, for example.
Indeed. I remember being at the Australian High Commission here in London, and we all cheered when that happened, because it was such an unexpected and very positive development. But of course, you know, 2000, it was a very different time. This was the period of South Korean determined engagement with North Korea. There was still the more positive approach of the Clinton administration in the United States, and the world has changed an awful lot since then.
Jean, I mean, a lot of people are also, the United States, for example, has said it will not accept a nuclear North Korea, but there are others who are saying, actually, this is a reality that we probably have to come to terms with very quickly.
There's no denying that North Korea has built its program. It's proven that it has nuclear devices and ballistic missiles. They've tested them to show us how far they can go. So we can't ignore the fact that they've developed these weapons to a certain point. How we're going to get the North Koreans to either freeze that program or abandon it completely is a question for the negotiators. It's going to be very tricky. I don't think they're willing to discuss it right now, but the new reality is that they have these weapons and they are very close to getting all of the parts of that elaborate system together to pose a real threat. We have an opening right now. They're a couple tests away from truly perfecting it. We have an opening right now to talk to them about backing off or freezing that program.
Because there are critics who are also saying, actually, Kim Jong-un's being quite strategic here to drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea. Do you think the US would be welcoming these talks and willing to also come on the sort of reach out to North Korea?
This is the tricky issue. In dealing with North Korea, the most important thing for the U.S. and its allies is to maintain a united front. North Korea does like to drive a wedge between those allies, and they do like to play a divide and conquer game. So the smart thing now would be to remain united, even though the United States and South Korea might have slightly different approaches when it comes to North Korea right now. Remember that we now in Seoul have a more liberal, engagement-focused president. So this is a very different administration in Seoul than the past two. And of course, we have a different administration in the White House, a different president who is very vocal and likes to use rhetoric to try to enforce change. So, but it's important now, even though they have these different points of view or different approaches, that they still try to maintain a united front so that North Korea can't drive itself in there to try to divide them.
And Jim, I mean, it's now, we need to look at what happens next, whether these reunions of families takes place or whether it leads to easing of sanctions, for example.
I think the difficulty is always knowing at the moment what the American administration intends. There are different sounds come from different quarters. But for once, the president has been more positive than one might have expected. He said, I'll meet Kim Jong-un, or I'll talk to him anyway. And that's a positive thing. It's not undermining the South Korean attempt to build a different relationship with North Korea. And so that is positive. But the difficulty is that as far as the United States is concerned, the real issue is the nuclear issue, as Jean has said, and that for the North Koreans are not going to just sit back and take whatever the United States wants. They will want a price for, I don't think they'll give up their nuclear program, but they might cap it.
That was Jim Hoare and Jean Lee speaking to me there a little earlier.
I'm so lonely, broken angel. I'm so